Animals are a produce safety concern because they can carry human pathogens and can be difficult to control. The use of pre-harvest assessments and no-harvest buffer zones can help us identify and reduce risks associated with animals on the farm. A pre-harvest assessment is a tool used to assess risks and make decisions about the produce to be harvested. The assessment aims to identify any factors that could impact the crop's safety, including wildlife, domesticated animals, adjacent land use, or isolated events like flooding. The Produce Safety Rule mandates that produce contaminated with known or foreseeable hazards, including animal feces, should be identified and not be harvested. To identify contamination risks, a pre-harvest assessment of the growing area should be conducted. In the event of contamination, it's crucial to establish clear and immediate action steps or corrective actions. To avoid harvesting contaminated fresh produce, it's necessary for all harvesters to assess risks and know how to identify contaminated produce. If contamination is identified, workers must know what steps to take to ensure produce is not harvested. Establishing a no-harvest buffer zone is one way workers can prevent risks once contamination is identified. Although the FSMA Produce Safety Rule does not mandate a no-harvest buffer zone, it can be used to effectively reduce the risk of fecal contamination in the field. For instance, if animal feces or significant animal activity is found in the field, the grower may choose to establish buffer zones, refrain from harvesting in a set area, or implement other corrective actions to minimize contamination risks. To determine the appropriate buffer zone size, growers need to assess factors like weather conditions, the amount of fecal material or animal activity, proximity of contamination risk to produce, and the extent of the problem. The recommended size of no-harvest buffer zones ranges from 0 to 25 feet, which depends on factors such as crop type, weather, the type of contamination event, and the equipment used for harvesting. 0 feet may be appropriate for tree fruit where feces was found on the ground and it's unlikely the produce is contaminated. 25 feet may be used if large amounts of animal intrusion occurs, like the neighbor's cows getting into the produce field and the contamination risk is widespread and unknown. Ultimately, the farm's food safety manager must use their best judgment to establish a buffer size that prevents contamination of fresh produce. When deciding how to handle contamination, several measures can be implemented. These include removal of contaminants and contaminated produce, burying it, flagging or taping off the area, and implementing other strategies. It's important to evaluate the potential risks that may result from each action, such as cross-contamination of equipment with feces. Although the FSMA Produce Safety Rule does not require these records to be kept, it is recommended to document pre-harvest assessments, animal monitoring, records of intrusion and contamination events, and any corrective measures taken. The documentation of worker trainings related to domestic animals and wildlife are not required to be performed separately from other on-farm worker training. But the training must cover how to identify and reduce risks. Workers must be trained not to harvest contaminated produce or use equipment that is contaminated.